Well, hello and welcome to our weekly look at Inside Syria. I'm Stephen Cole. It's been a week of intense fighting between rival rebel groups in northern Syria. They have a common enemy in Syria's President Assad, but now Syrian rebels and al-Qaeda linked fighters are battling each other. The Western-backed Free Syrian Army and a number of smaller rebel groups are taking on fighters from the armed group, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, the ISIL. Well, it's led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and is believed to have thousands of fighters. The group has been criticised for the increasing violence in Syria, including civilian deaths and seizing journalists, aid workers and activists. From Beirut, Zaina Hodder reports.
There is another war within a war in the rebel-controlled north of Syria. Syrian opposition groups joined forces against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Rebels and al-Qaeda fighters have clashed in the past, but the ongoing violence is unprecedented. It seems to be a coordinated and surprise assault that has put the al-Qaeda-linked group on the defensive, but the foreign fighters are not surrendering.
The Islamic State equaled the Assad regime in their ruthlessness. That's why we decided to fight them. We won't stop until they're finished.
Rebel forces and many Syrians who once welcomed the help of the foreign fighters now want them to leave. They played a leading role in attacks against the Syrian regime, but these men were no longer just on the front lines. They were busy laying the foundations for a future Islamic State and, according to the opposition, cementing power. The group has been criticized by some for its strict interpretations of Islamic law and imposing what some called brutal tactics against the population. ISIL said it was being stabbed in the back by some groups involved in a conspiracy that seeks to get rid of al-Qaeda before planned peace talks in Geneva. Rebel commanders deny they are waging this war on behalf of the international community. Fighting in the rebel-held north undoubtedly weakens the opposition in its fight against the regime. But in the long term, it may be able to benefit from this battle. Al-Qaeda's presence in Syria has been one of the reasons for the international community's reluctance to provide military support to the rebels. And the regime has been able to portray the fight as one against terrorism. But the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant is not the only al-Qaeda-linked group in Syria. The Nusra Front is mainly made up of Syrian fighters. And just like the ISIL, Nusra wants to set up an Islamic State in Syria. The West has designated a terrorist organization, but so far it hasn't lost support from Syrians. There is an unprecedented show of unity among armed opposition groups in this battle. It was the lack of unity that allowed al-Qaeda to expand its reach in Syria. This won't be an easy fight. The fight for power among opposition forces has only started. Zaina Hodder for Inside Syria, Beirut.
As we know, there are several hardline religious opposition groups fighting in Syria. The group called the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant has risen to prominence very suddenly and very violently. So, what is it? Who are they? The group was established as an umbrella organization of Iraqi armed groups in October 2006 under the name of Islamic State of Iraq. It's been responsible for the deaths of thousands of Iraqi civilians as well as members of the Iraqi government and its international allies. By late 2012, the group was said to have renewed its strengths and more than doubled its number of fighters to about 3,000. Some estimates put that number between 3,000 and 5,000 now. And in April last year, the group changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant and became deeply involved in the Syrian civil war. Its fighters are mostly active in the northern and eastern provinces of Syria. So to understand more about what is going on the ground and in this war-torn country and what it means for the Syrian conflict, we're joined by our three guests. In New York, Richard Barrett. He's the former head of the UN's al-Qaeda monitoring team. In Rome, Fawaz Gerges, a professor of Middle East politics and international relations at the London School of Economics. And Professor Fawaz is also the author of The Rise and Fall of al-Qaeda. And here in Doha, Saleh Mubarak, a member of the Syrian National Council and a professor at Qatar University. So welcome to you all. But let's go to Rome. first, and Fawaz Gerges. Fawaz, hundreds have died, civilians and fighters, in the first 5 days of confrontation between the al-Qaeda-affiliated Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant and other rebel groups. This casualty rate is now rivaling, if not outstripping, the toll inflicted by the wider war between the regime and rebel groups.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you have multiple wars within the Syrian war. Stephen, if there is one particular point I want to make today, is that wars fundamentally change societies, and Syria is no exception. What started as a political uprising against the Assad regime with aspirations for an open society has basically mutated into all-out war dominated by ultra-conservative Islamist forces and al-Qaeda jihadists. What you're seeing today is basically most armed rebels, both the ultra-conservative Islamists and al-Nusra Front, a linked al-Qaeda group, along with the Free Syrian Army, are trying to basically expel the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham from Syria because of the damage that it has done, not only to Syrian society, but also to the image and the standing of the Syrian uprising outside Syria. What we need to understand is that the Syrian conflict has mutated into multiple wars within this larger war between the armed opposition and the Assad regime.
Let's go to Richard Barrett. Richard, we gave an indication of a rough guide to the ISIL, but tell us what you know of this group and why are they in Syria and in what kind of numbers, by your estimation?
Yes, certainly. Well, as you said, the Islamic State of Iraq began in 2006, but that had its origins already in the al-Qaeda group formed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in around 2004. And then, as you said, it got beaten back before the Americans withdrew their troops from Iraq until in the end of 2011 it was fairly quiet. But since then it's come back. And I think now probably between the two countries, certainly according to the Iraqi foreign minister recently, has probably about 12,000 members. I think that's a fairly imprecise figure. I'm not sure that anybody really knows exactly how many of them there are. But what's happened is that the head of the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has seen an opportunity in Syria really to extend the range of his influence. I mean, he's not concerned that there's a border between Iraq and Syria. What he wants to do is to carve out some territory. And because the Syrian forces, of course, have been weak, the rebels have allowed them space because, of course, they want more support against President Assad. He's been able to capture this territory, particularly in eastern Syria, but also, as you say, in the north, to actually give himself some sort of sense that he's in control of an area that he can use for training, storage, recuperation, and all this sort of thing. And it's empowered them quite considerably, I think.
Saleh Mubarak, how strong, how entrenched is al-Qaeda and or the extreme hardline groups in Syria now?
Well, first of all, the Syrian people are predominantly Muslims, and you know the Islamic labels are flying everywhere. It doesn't mean that they are hardliners.
Are you saying ISIL
No, I didn't say that. But I'm saying is that the Syrian people on the ground rank those organizations not necessarily according to the American rankings. And as Zaina Khudr mentioned in the report, people in Syria, and I've spoken to many, make a big distinction between ISIL and al-Nusra. While there is...
What kind of distinction are they making then?
There seemed to be a consensus that ISIL is a terrorist, that we don't want it. There is suspicion in how it was created, in how it's financed, in all of these. And there is a common desire among all the Syrians to get rid of them because they're as, you know, dictators as the Assad regime itself. And they want to impose a very strict interpretation of Islam on us. We do, and furthermore, most of the land they captured, they did not capture from the Assad regime. They captured from other rebel groups. So they're not really liberating lands. They're capturing liberated lands. And we've done, you know, we've tolerated a lot because we did not want to resort to fighting with them. But in the end, we found ourselves forced to, have a confrontation with them.
Fawaz Gerges, let's turn to the Kurds briefly. They're fighting for control over areas where they predominate, clashing daily with Islamist and other rebel groups. So, in a way, are we starting to see the carve-up of territory in Syria?
Well, I mean, we're seeing all-out struggle within the armed groups, whether you're talking about the Kurds, whether you're talking about the religious nationalists, and whether you're talking about the Islamists. I mean, Stephen, look at this particular distinction. With all my respect to your guest in Doha, he says Syrians make distinctions. First of all, I don't know who are the Syrians who make the distinctions between the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham and al-Nusra Front. Al-Nusra Front has sworn bay'ah to Ayman Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda Central, who succeeded Osama bin Laden. Al-Nusra Front wants to establish an Islamic State similar to the Taliban. And one particular point here, we need to remind our viewers, it was the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant that established both Al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham. The same ideology, the same worldview, the same mindset, even though, of course, the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham is much more extremist than Al-Nusra Front. Who knows that Al-Nusra Front is not really biding its time, waiting for empowerment, and then it can turn against the various armed groups inside Syria. So to answer your question directly about the Kurds are no different than the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham, than Al-Nusra Front, than the various armed groups who are basically trying to seize territories and basically maximize their bargaining power on the negotiating table. One particular point I want to conclude my own segment is that what has happened in Syria in the last 3 years is basically a truly, a sea change. Think how the Syrian uprising has started. Think of the initial aspirations. Think of the idea of a pluralistic, open, democratic society. We're talking now, you and I, about the differences between Al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State, and even the Islamic Front. We have not really talked about the Islamic Front, a coalition of ultra-conservative Islamists who would like to establish an Islamic State as opposed to an open, democratic, and pluralistic state inside Syria.
Richard Barrett, you don't speak for the US government, I know, but how will the US government, do you estimate, and also the United Nations, react to the rise to prominence of the ISIL in Syria? Will some of the doves say, well, we told you so, we mustn't go anywhere near Syria? And will this, in turn, this prominence of ISIL, will that also tell the hawks, we're not going to go anywhere near, we're not going to interfere in Syria?
Well, I think it's a good basis to start from, that interfering in Syria may have a short-term objective, but the long-term consequences would be extremely uncertain. But what I think really dominates thinking at the United Nations particularly, and probably in the US administration as well, is the enormous humanitarian crisis in Syria. You have now over 10 million people displaced from their homes. And you can understand, I think, that many of these people who have faced now uncertainty since March 2011 when the uprising started, but particularly from the summer of that year when the violence began, what can they hold on to? Where is the end going to come from? And I think that's why perhaps some of the more conservative groups have support, because if you take away Assad, well, what sort of government will you be putting in its place? And I think for most Syrians, ordinary Syrian people, they want a government with clear lines, with clear understanding of what the rules are and so on. And unfortunately, there isn't some sort of, less conservative movement which is offering a political program to rival the Islamic Front or al-Sham, it's one of its key members, or even al-Nusra and so on. And I think the point about ISIL or ISIS, whatever you would like to call it, and al-Nusra, is that yes, they do absolutely conform to the same ideology as Professor Gerges says. But the point is what ISIL has done, I think, is attract a whole lot of foreign thugs to try and find their, soldiers of fortune almost, to come in and get engaged, who have absolutely no understanding of religion, let alone of Sharia and so on. So I think al-Nusra probably represents the more, well, certainly the official al-Qaeda, if you like, in Syria, whereas ISIL is now becoming just a spin-off with no relevance very much, I think, to the future of the country, apart from bringing more bloodshed.
Saleh, will this current round of what can only be described as vicious fighting with the ISIL and the rebel groups, will that become, do you think, entrenched as a third conflict, whereas the Assad government regime will sit back and say, this is great?
Well, unfortunately, that's what's happening now. We hope that this conflict ends soon with the expulsion of the ISIL.
Who's going to expel ISIL?
Well, there is a direction. Actually, I was reading the new government that is being formed, the new defense minister, Mr. Assad Mustafa, who you know, is part of the coalition.
I mean, the question people are asking is, have they hijacked the Islamic Revolution in Syria?
Well, it has been hijacked, and I've said it many times here on Al Jazeera, on other outlets. I partially blame the West for not helping the mainstream Syrian Free Army to, you know, be armed well.
So it's the West's fault that ISIL?
Well, in part, you know, partially yes, partially because at the beginning when we asked the West for more weapons and more quality weapons,
well, they were worried that where the weapons would go. That's the reason they didn't send weapons.
No, they knew exactly where to go, and they knew exactly the leadership of the Free Syrian Army, and because we did not get it. And unfortunately, all these
whoever's fault it is, the ISIL are there and they're in force. One estimate, Richard Barrett is talking about 6,000 to 12,000 fighters. That's a lot of fighters.
But in the fight, in the 5-6 days in the past week, ISIL has lost a lot of territory, and they were retreating, and hopefully they will be able to defeat it. Not only this, many of its soldiers actually defected. There is one, they call them Amir, who actually is coming out and telling...
All right, that's an interesting point. Fawaz Gerges, is this a short-term conflict?
Oh, on the contrary, Stephen, I wish. This is a highly complex and prolonged conflict. In fact, the longer the conflict continues, the more it will mutate. And no one knows how this particular conflict will basically either unfold or evolve or devolve, as we know from various countries in Afghanistan and Somalia and Lebanon and Iraq and other places. I think the challenge, the sooner a negotiated settlement is reached, the better for the Syrian people, not just because of the humanitarian crisis, Stephen. We're talking about one of the greatest humanitarian crises probably in the 20th century and the 21st century.
Well, agreement seems to be a very long way off, because we haven't even started to talk about Geneva for the very reason that we have no idea who will be there and who will be talking to whom. But Richard Barrett, formerly in the United Nations, who outside Syria or Iraq backs ISIL?
Well, I don't think anyone backs ISIL, quite frankly. I'm sure President Assad is very happy to see the rebels fighting one another, but although initially you could say that some of the members of ISIL were Syrians who had been encouraged, if you like, by the government to go to Iraq and fight, I don't think there's any more control now or even influence over what ISIL is doing. Iraq too, I don't think it's in Iraq's interest whatsoever to support ISIL. It is a monster which is out of control, and as we've seen in Fallujah, it's extremely difficult to get it back under control, if possible at all. So I think ISIL is somebody who, or is a group rather, which has the capacity, unlike almost any other group, to combine everybody against it. I think it's really on its own, and I think al-Nusra, although al-Nusra has been trying to play a mediating role, I think al-Nusra is also increasingly against it. So I think ISIL is not going to be necessarily a long-term factor in this, but as the fight goes on, as Professor Gerges was saying, you have this hardening of position, whether it's between Islamist and more moderate Muslims, or whether it's between Shia and Sunni, or whether it's between Kurd and Arab, and so on. And as that hardening goes on, of course, it becomes increasingly difficult to think that the country can ever go back together again, which may be already impossible.
And Saleh Mubarak, does this so-called third conflict being watched by the Americans and, of course, the Russians, does that let the West off the hook?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think there is a move now, I started mentioning that, to consolidate all the fighting forces under the umbrella of the new government, which is part of the coalition. And I really hope that that will happen, and there will be a clear leadership, a clear agenda. We've been working on this for a long time, but unfortunately it did not happen. I hope it happens. I don't know when. But I want to mention something very quickly. We have very, I want to say solid evidence that the Assad regime has contributed to the ISL's, emerge and strengthening. And we have a reason that to believe that he has a good support to that, because it will weaken. Are you saying
the Assad regime, or members of the Assad regime, perhaps some outside forces in Iran, are you talking about they are behind, or some elements of the ISIL? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes. In fact, I believe...
Is there any evidence
perhaps
to support
your guests remember the name Abu al-Qaqa. Abu al-Qaqa was a Syrian terrorist leader who had linked with the Assad regime, who was sending fighters to Iraq. He was later killed, but there was a clear link between the Assad regime and those fighters who go allegedly to fight the Americans in Iraq, who are terrorists. And it's the same group now that is, that came back from Iraq to Syria, the ISIL.
Fawaz Gerges, does President Assad have a hand behind information and deployment of the ISIL, and some in Tehran, well, which I think is what we're hearing from here?
I'm sorry, I don't have any evidence, any concrete evidence, any credible evidence to basically show that the Assad regime had a major hand in the establishment of the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham. Let me be clear about one point, Stephen. I deal with details, with facts. It was al-Qaeda in Iraq and Asham that established both al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham. It was al-Qaeda in Iraq, of course, changed its name into the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham. Let's keep in mind that the reason why the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham was established, because there was a major conflict between al-Nusra Front and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham. This is the reality. And in fact, I would argue the longer the conflict continues, the more the hardliners will gain momentum and power inside Syria, because there is no military solution to this essentially political crisis.
Okay, Richard, who's holding the balance of power now against the Syrian regime? The Free Syrian Army or the hardline so-called extremist groups?
I think the situation is so fluid, particularly seen from outside, that you can't really say that one group is dominant over another. We see all these shifting alliances. Now we have the Islamic Front, which seems to be doing quite well, but how long that alliance will last, I don't know. And of course, there's very, very many. I mean, I read one report which estimated there could be up to 1,000 different groups in the on the rebel cause. So I think it's much too fluid to say who's dominant at the moment and what may happen. I think what we can say is that the fighting between the rebels and the regime has now died down to a sort of stalemate, which I think is one of the reasons and one of the opportunities that the rebels have to try and sort out among themselves, what their program is and who they want inside the tent and who they want outside the tent. But I couldn't agree more with what's been said before. This conflict is not going to end anytime soon. Geneva, I think, is unlikely. I mean, even if they meet in Geneva now, it's unlikely to produce anything. We've seen what's happening in the meeting in Spain, that the external opposition can't really agree who should even represent them in Geneva. So we're faced with a situation where all the activity is going to go on inside the country, and the more that happens, the worse, of course, it becomes for not only the Syrian people, but for the future of Syria.
Richard, thank you for that, indeed. And thanks to my guests. In New York, Richard Barrett. In Rome, Fawaz Gerges. And here in the studio, Saleh Mubarak. And that's all for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what is happening in Syria, not just on this programme, but with our hourly news programmes, and of course online at aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching Inside Syria. I'm Stephen Cole. Goodbye to you.